My name is Justin Dials. I'm an assistant professor of architecture here at the Knowlton School. And it is my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, architect Neil Denari. Neil's not only our lecturer this evening, but also one of this year's Herbert Baumer Distinguished Visiting Professors. He is more specifically our Distinguished Visiting Professor of Practice. And in this position, he is involved in a unique course that, in which he's serving two roles. One is as subject of the course, but also active participant. And this course, this seminar course, which is run with our G3 graduate students, is it's described in our curriculum as the Master Practitioner Seminar. And the purpose of the course, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, is to put our third-year graduate students who are on the verge of starting their own careers in the field in close contact with an exemplary practitioner. And since I'm involved in the course, I'm up here instead of Andrew Cruz. Andrew invited me to do the introduction, and I've had the great pleasure of teaching with Neil over the past 2 days. And I want to make it clear, because it becomes so clear when you're involved in the class, and I want to give all of you a window into that. It becomes so clear when you're in the class that Baumer professors are not just architects who have significant or significantly productive practices. These are architects who also endeavor to conspicuously and effectively pursue practice with significance. And I think there's a big difference. Neil Denari is clearly an architect that embraces this mode. And over the past 2 days of, is it too loud? Sorry. And over the past 2 days of seminar sessions, the students and I have been continuously reminded that he not only pushes his projects out into the world with great intention and significance, but he's also capable of speaking about them with great clarity and eloquence. And for this and many other reasons, I'm very eager to trade places with him here at the podium. But before I do, I think it's important to briefly share with you some of the compelling issues that have been in play over the past few days in the seminar. Unfortunately, not all of you can participate, but I can at least, as a sort of foreign correspondent, report back to you some of the things that have happened there so that the discussion gets into the school. And I think one of the main questions is why architects, that we've been discussing over the past few days, is why architects write, and what is the value of an architect writing. We've also been talking about the continuing significance or insignificance of architectural publications. And for me, Neil is someone who has been around the entirety of my career as an architect. And when his monograph, Gyroscopic Horizons, was published in 1999, it was a major event. And so it's also instructive for me to recognize how much has shifted since that time. There have been several other monographs published subsequently or after Gyroscopic Horizons, maybe FOA Architects, FOA's ARC. I think that's a similarly significant publication, but I do start to see that the significance of these publications is questionable now. When Gyroscopic Horizons was introduced in '99, it was like a major Hollywood movie being, hitting the theaters. You could really only see it there, and you dutifully went to experience it in the way that had been intended. And I think that we get information about architecture in a very, very different way now. You can see 50 to 100 projects a day just looking casually, scrolling Design or Sucker Punch and other design blogs that you may follow. And it's not to say that these modes of looking at architecture are bad, because they're certainly not. They're really interesting in their own right. However, it does leave the significance of the architectural publication in a curious place. And so one of the things that we've been talking about in the seminar is Neil's forthcoming book, Mass X, which will be released later in the spring of next year. It's a work that has taken him 6 years, is that correct? 6 years of continuous work. And it really challenges the idea that the monograph is something that's just collecting things that we've all already seen on our screens before. In some ways, it's not trying to make a case for the monograph being a superior mode of looking at architecture, but a significant mode that needs to be encountered and understood on its own terms. And to that end, I think that he's doubled down on what a monograph can do, and is continuing to explore it as he does his architecture as a significant and rigorous experiment to see what the range of the monograph can be. And so, in some ways, it's very much an architectural project in its own right. It's a site for the drawings of projects which are already out into the world. One of the things that will make it, let's say, a must visit for those who want to understand his work is that even projects that are built, like the Highline project, which many of you know, have been redrawn and reformatted specifically for the site of this book. So actually the best way to get the latest information about the Highline project is not to go to the Highline project, but actually to go to his monograph when it's published in March. Because the building, while it has not been redesigned, has, I think, been thought about in new ways already through the medium of this publication. So I think that has been a really interesting conversation for me and the students to participate in with Neil. I would say, along with that, Neil has, through the specificity of his practice, I think helped us refocus on the importance of the Baumer Seminar as a site where we explore the new ways of looking at architecture and explore what are the most relevant ways of looking at architecture. And I think that for me, this is only the second time I've done it, working with Neil has helped us to understand that focusing on one architect's work is actually a very rich way of actually kind of looking at, let's say, a hub that radiates out and touches a lot of interests of relevance in multiple practices and the discipline as a whole. So, having done my duty as foreign correspondent, I'd like to introduce Neil himself. He's not only the principal of Neil and Denari Architects in Los Angeles, but also a tenured professor at UCLA, where he has taught for many years. He continuously teaches peripatetically as a traveling and visiting professor, both here and most recently at the University of Pennsylvania. And he's had a long career. He's a Texan, a New Yorker, and an Angelino, also big in Japan. As a Texan, he studied at the University of Houston. As a New Yorker, well, I guess you were briefly also a Bostoner, and studied at the GSD. Then became a New Yorker, where he both worked for Porsche and started his own explorations as an independent architect while teaching. He subsequently moved to Los Angeles, where he started his firm, Cortex Architects. And it was really during this time period that he developed the work that became Gyroscopic Horizons. While in New York in 1986, Neil was at 29 the youngest member of the exhibition 40 Architects under age 40. Also in 1986, the Cooper Hewitt Museum purchased a drawing by Neil Denari, and this is the first of 7 major art museums which now hold his work, including the Museum of Modern Art. since, let's see, I think I've covered all of this. Oh, so what I will say is that I've talked extensively about gyroscopic horizons. Previous to that, and to obviously this forthcoming monograph, there was Interrupted Projections, a book that we've been looking to quite a lot in the seminar. That was published in 1996. In 2011, he received the Los Angeles AIA Gold Medal. It's the organization's highest honor for an individual architect. He's a registered architect in New York and California, a member of the American Institute of Architects, who also recently honored him with a fellow, the title of fellow in Atlanta this spring. He has given more than 230 lectures around the world on his work. This one may make, 250. It would be nice if it were a significant number. But we are very happy to welcome him back here to the school. Please help me in welcoming Neil Denari.
Thank you, Justin, and it's great to be back again. Thanks for everybody coming. You know, when you hear an introduction like that, all you can think about is there's an adage that says you get to be a young architect before the age of 50, and then after that you're an architect. I think if you're alive, you're a young architect. That's what I think. So live the spirit of everything always happens tomorrow, and it's great to be reminded of what you've done, but it's a project about tomorrow, really. This is a lecture that on the one hand follows up from, I think, 18 months ago, where I showed a lot of new work and introduced a number of ideas, and I'll only rehearse one project to start, and then we'll go into, I think, 5 or 6 projects that we've been working on, have finished, or are in progress, so there's a lot of recent work to the project. So the lesser known, if you hear that term, you might hear it in terms of something like so-and-so was a lesser known impressionist, or X was a lesser known photographer, or printmaker, or novelist. So why would somebody be lesser known as a person? They weren't as accomplished, something eclipsed them, or someone eclipsed them at a certain time. The thought about lesser known, on the one hand, for me, relative to the idea of something that's been more and more an issue for me in my office, is audience. And what audiences know, and what the public knows, and what the intelligentsia knows, and what we know as a culture. And it's come really to my mind that, when I try to break down and analyze the work, either formally or culturally or politically, I feel like more and more I want to do that and for the public. And I don't consider you the public. You're an audience that is understands and discriminates at some particular level. But more and more, what we imagine we all share and know is a little bit different. But the degree to which we know something is really what I'm kind of talking about here. And when I say signs and media, signs and meaning in the work, I want to try to do a little bit of a semiotic analysis on some of the new work. I'm going to start with just a few preparatory slides, because it's important to distinguish 2 or 3 agendas at the beginning of what I'm talking about. Okay, here's a photograph of a special event at some point. It's in London, and all the gentlemen are wearing their tuxedos and striped suits, and of course they're all wearing the bowler hat, and you've all seen them. And when you see this image, you might assume that that hat was invented for the British aristocracy somehow. They own it at some particular level. It's part of an ensemble. It's part of a totalizing world. The guy in the background without the hat doesn't look nearly as sophisticated and imperious as everybody else who's got the bowler hat on. You may know that hat actually was worn in America by the middle class in, the 19th century, farmers, when they got dressed up for family pictures. They had the bowler hat on. So at one level, your association with what this object is here in terms of status or class was shockingly changed in this film, Clockwork Orange by Stanley Kubrick, where he, we're talking about costume design and today with Jeff, and a lot of this is things that I've been thinking about too. So they wear the white outfits, they've got the black stormtrooper boots, both sending signals. The white outfit, spy versus spy conversation even today in black and white, sends messages about good and bad, and by the time they put the bowler hat on, they're borrowing and stealing from the goodness of the aristocracy of the British, and by the time they put it on, and then they put on the whole cock belt thing and the clubs, and then they go beat the hell out of innocent people. Of course, Kubrick wants to graft associations of another type and another culture just through the placement of the object, and we know that that's a project in every world, in every art form. So you look at the posters, and by the way, there was the one eye done up, and so he takes the bowler hat, and it becomes actually the icon, for which the movie is pitched and made, and he's even furthering the argument that I'm going to tell you that shocking things happen, in the future to your understanding of what, is within the limits of how we think and operate. So one agenda is about, obviously, something like the familiar in the context of the familiar and the known. And why I present that is because I actually don't think what we do is as odd or weird or over the top as a lot of architects who we might look at and admire. That there's something about the known in our work, but it's lesser known. It's lesser or harder to kind of identify than the project of the odd, let's say. The second issue that I want to fold in is the question of architecture in the contemporary world. This is a photograph in the Milan Cathedral by Thomas Struth, and architecture in all of its most historical, densest, rhetorical, ritualistic, collecting bodies in space, et cetera, et cetera. And then here's everyday life. So actually, Jeff and I were talking at lunch that one of the profound projects and problems, let's say, that architects should be working on, I feel like I want to contribute to the project, the issue is whether the work does or not, is between the leftover idea of architecture as here we are in space, you bothered to show up to hear my voice and not watch the video later on, and we collaborate at some level. And everyday life, here are a couple of teenagers with their phones, having lunch, et cetera, et cetera. So the this is us part of the world. I'm in favor of everything melting into air. I'm in favor of the quicksilver nature of media. I've always said that. And yet here I am practicing and stating that architecture is a very material discipline. Paint even has weight and qualities and so forth. So I want to try and track the first issue of the known and the degree to which you know or see what's familiar to you in relation to the idea of can architecture work and participate in the world of the immaterial. Okay, here's a very simple geometric, I wouldn't call it an analysis, I just call it a diagram of the way in which, in this particular case, in a Cartesian framework, of course starting with some idea of the cube, here as a closed volume or its partial enclosure in an L. You can think of a lot of architects have explored geometry as a kind of primitive and where it goes from there. Here, when we look at a single surface project from the reference of the Cartesian, which is the ultimate in the known, to a project where we've got a radius transition between horizontal and vertical, which in a geometric sense is also deeply primitive. And in the next transformation where we just turn and make the cylinder into a cone that actually meets at a corner, so that one profile we can have the ultimate in the known on one end, and let's say 1 degree difference away from that. So we could say that this is the lesser known, just in purely geometric terms. Now, when we work it in terms of a solid, if we throw a cone into, let's say this is the elevation, this is a side elevation, where we have a closed figure with a radius on one corner, quantitatively we have 1, 2, 3 hyper-known Cartesian corners and then a radial transition, that when you read them together, they're deeply simple Platonic devices, but even when you oppose the corner of the radius to the radius opposing figures, as we say, I want to argue at this moment that the project of curvature practiced by Hadid or practiced by Morphosis or at times practiced by Ito, who to varying and lesser degrees make political and cultural statements to the extent that, if you're not working on the project of the curve, then you wouldn't be working on a contemporary form of architecture, and anything else just, like there's a clean break there. You can see, and I'm already painting the picture, that somehow it's not ambivalence that won't allow a complete unleashing of talent and ability and will to make a project that's more foreign, but something that really is trying to reference the idea that architecture shouldn't be just distracting, it shouldn't be a spectacle, it should somehow coexist and participate in a world in which we read, in this particular case, conditions that we know really well as the grounding of production of architecture and life into, let's say, not easy ways of modifying that, but let's say direct ways to do that. Now, I think I showed this last time, this house, which unfortunately didn't get built. Now, having just shown you that first slide, all you have to do is scan, the entire project and go, it's a 28-foot wide by 30-foot tall bounding box, and all we're doing, at least on a geometric level in this project, is searching for a combination of geometric effects, all which are based on just what I laid out. There's nothing more going on geometrically. It's a question of plus and minus in this work. Now, I didn't really tell you the story of this project, and because I only have a few projects to show and it won't be a super lengthy lecture, let me indulge you with what we do now is we work on commission projects, and we obviously have agents who are involved in that. This family, the parents were born and raised New Yorkers, and they told me stories, and they've lived in LA for about 20 years, of growing up in New York. They grew up in middle-class apartment buildings, opaque buildings with punched windows looking out to the city scene and so forth. And curiously, on one evening early on in the process, we studied these two houses in a little architecture seminar. They're incredible students of design, and they said, well, we don't want that much surface. We don't want to be reminded of New York that much, but we also don't want to participate in the ultimate fantasy of nothingness and floating over Los Angeles. We want something in between, and we need to understand architecture through its relationship between inside and outside and transparency. Now, I don't think I showed those as background projects, but this house, which you may know, the Live House in New Jersey, which is now moved, I think, to another site, which they called the Dumb Cube. I would argue, that our house is certainly not dumb, and we wouldn't claim that. But when you look at the ribbon window, and you look at the truncated circular window, and you look at the accumulation of triangular windows, you look at the carved out void, looking past all the graphics and so forth, and you multiply it times this project, which everyone knows top to bottom, right, this project, a square that becomes a frustum for a conic pyramid. It's a hybrid between a series of cones on the corner that create a closed figure on top that just could very well be itself a total skylight, except two small skylights are placed on top of that. When you take less opacity than Villa Mueller, more opacity than Villa Stahl, and you look at the specific ways in which the treatment of the windows works in relation to Fermini, except Fermini, if we look at this as being looking up at the top of Fermini, Fermini, of course, doesn't have a radius in the corner in the plan. It only has all radii at the top of the building. So 90 degrees in plan, partial quarter cones here going up to a closed figure. Now, what we do is we just make sure that this outer figure in the game between this is the window, this is the glass, but this is the entire window, we just make sure that we're have self-similar sort of situations. Here's a figure with 3 corners and 1 radius. Here's 3 radii and 1 corner. And so they work together, and the main thing that we do here is we make sure that the geometry is hyper clean. There's nothing that doesn't fit. Everything sort of snaps together, and that's probably part of the way in which we want to try to find a relationship between, I think I know what's going on with that window, but it's a little lesser known than a straight rectangular window. There's something a bit mysterious about it. I feel like I have a relationship to it. So I could begin to kind of play with that, because our clients, they wanted something cool. They wanted, nice windows and all of that, but there was a relationship between quantity in how much glass we would make. And in this case, the glass is very specific to transition and boys' bedrooms, bathroom, etc., in terms of functional conditions that produce, one imagines or one hopes, even here in the what you see is what you get project on the inside and the outside, an inverse bay window, basically. This project kind of sets in motion, I would say, a hyper-accumulation of all the very, very simple geometric premises that we're working on. And here you can see, by the time you look at the corner of each, a corner of the bounding box, with the same elements, there's a radically different condition going on. Most of it having to do with, let's say in this case, this is a cylinder which is, of course, parallel to the ground. Here's a cone which is parallel to the ground. This is a cylinder which is 45 degrees to the ground, and this is a cone also parallel to the ground. So in our simple, primitive world, we're playing a game with, yes, we're interested in the project of progress at the level of curvature and architecture. We don't let it go all the way toward a project in which, when you look at it and you say, that looks like a liquid spill, like you might say about a number of architects' projects, and it retains its known condition relative to modernism. It's white, in fact, in this case. So this is a bit of a rehearsal, and then I'll go into the way in which some of these things are working in newer projects. This one is in Frankfort. And it was an invited competition. There were 14 architects, including Himmelblau and Foster and Barco Leibinger. We were the only ones outside of Europe to be invited to do it. Here's the center core of Frankfurt, a big shopping mall as a kind of bubble in the middle of the city, and a new quarter with an axis, a very, very straight Haussmannian axis, with a very, very strict master plan, a elevated bridge with trains, cars, pedestrians, and so forth, a bit like the High Line project site, which is why we were invited. That was explicitly stated. They thought that we could handle a site like this. And it was also about the issue of the high-rise in Frankfurt. They call Frankfurt Manhattan. Main is the river Main, it runs through the city. So they call it Manhattan because here's the world in which the city has kind of grown up in, including over here that you don't see Wolf Prix's new central bank project. The zoning for it is 100 meters high, and there's zoning conditions going on. Now, what's happening with this project is a park which would fill in a dead space between existing housing and this new piece, which is governed in a master plan, is part of a project that, on the one hand, tectonically is mediated by a tower and a courtyard building, two typologies which are stuck together as though it was like an urban situation of two different buildings with a party wall. That's because of the program, and I'll explain that more in detail. Now, these kinds of diagrams are meant to, not seduce. They're actually meant to explain. I don't know that I'm persuading with any of this right now. This is sort of, here's what happened. Now, by the time we take the zoning envelope, we have to deal with all the conditions of setbacks and so forth. And we decide to put one piece of the program, which is a series of high design units that would be done by Porsche Design. This building is for Porsche Design, branded as Porsche Design in Frankfurt. A courtyard building that is levitating on V-shaped columns, and a parking garage, above grade parking, oddly enough. That would be a third program in this packaging. Okay, here's the Porsche Design logo, which I think was designed quite a while ago. And this is a company that's designed black watches and aviator sunglasses and everything super pure. And Ferdinand Porsche was the guy who said, beauty comes from the program. He was one of the high modern masters. You can line them all up. In fact, I'll talk about a couple of them tonight. So this is a P and a D, obviously, and it's the same figure. And so all we did was separate the two. We know that they're mirrored and inversed. So we took a parallelogram, we copy it, and we mirror inverse it. And in an arrangement, here's the program of apartments, here's the program of parking, and then the tower up above, multiplied times the known official Farben palette, the color palette of the project. Now, I'll talk about the dog in a second. An architect, now what architect do you know, maybe besides my office, would look at the logo of a company and then do a formal analysis on the logo and then argue that the way in which the repetitive symmetrical mirror geometry and the mirroring of a certain window type drives meaning back into a project that is identified by black ink on a white page. Now, most of you might think that's a really taboo project because it doesn't drive all the way back into site conditions and so forth. Well, it's just one element of the project, an important element of the project on the one hand, because the other issue was, here's a 7-story base. It runs entirely through this Europa Alley project. We knew, of course, there's a tower, and we actually thought that the project was how to put together a tower and a base, but do it differently than Seagram or not Seagram, Lieberhaus or other projects even that we had done. So the window pattern, of course, migrates all the way up the tower, and it's indiscriminate to program. This is the program of the parking garage. We thought it doesn't need to say anything different, and we used it as a defamiliarizing device. Here's the facade system for the courtyard building with the studio apartments, and then you get the main apartments up above. Now, the mongrel dog is a dog, of course, which is produced out of a dirty gene pool on the one hand. It's got its elements of clean genes somewhere back in it. But in this particular case, the gene pool allowed a beautiful, consistent coloration where the spots work all the way across the head, across the body, down the legs, and so forth. So this is really, for us, a curious case of the mongrel project, not even trying to claim to be beautiful. I'm not sure I'd stand up and say it's the most beautiful project, but I would also say that, endearingly enough, it might be beautiful based on the techniques that we applied to it to, quote unquote, make it work and make it respond to the project. All the pitching and sloping of the surface, part of it is based on solar conditions, mountain range views to downtown, etc. And it's not the first time that we've used the diagonal window. We were using it in Keelung, and I'll show you another project. Needless to say, the window itself, as you saw in the previous house, has become a site of investigation, which for us might have first been the project about defamiliarizing architecture by refusing to make rectangular windows, because it's the most normative device we have. But in this particular case, trying to essentially produce a kind of scaling to the entire project through the repetition and the mirroring of the supergraphic size forms, the forms of the windows, which don't, of course, send messages automatically about typical residential striation. That certainly is happening right here. So the juxtaposition of balcony system with sliding glass doors, which is a known typology all around Europe, combined with these zigzag end elevations, we were trying to find a way in which this can be a lesser known type of tower, let's say, within the city. I'll show you a project that was designed a couple months ago, and it follows on somewhat from this particular project. This is in Los Angeles. Here's downtown Los Angeles. This is the City Hall, and if you've been there, for reference, there's SciArc here. This is the LA River, and all through here is considered to be an arts district that will undergo more and more development. There's a large Michael Malson project, which is just in construction here and been completed. And this is a project of a collective master plan for a developer called SunCal, and it was organized by AECom, and I think there were about a dozen architects, mostly from Los Angeles, working on this site for a mixed-use project. So the master plan, this is actually downtown's back over here. We were looking from this view across the site here. A large tower on the corner, a hotel, and our site given to us was also for a hotel. This is live-work housing, small museum, etc. And so this project, we now own the diagonal window. You can't use it. You probably don't want to, but it's not easy to get the shades to work on the inside, but we have tricks with that. This is looking back on 6th Street, and the particular issues of the project here were how to take a fairly odd footprint site, and this is for a boutique hotel. And boutique hotel is, I would say, a code word for, yes, there's economic logic and there's efficiency and so forth. But we took it as a code word for a certain type of experience that could be quantified in terms of how much you pay for a room. And the particular thing about this project is it's actually a very thin slab that works diagonally across the first layer into the site with various perturbations. And you can see that the techniques that we're employing always now, very simply, these are just quarter cones, book matched, running up the side of the building, which give it and break down and give it a sense of 4 bundles or 4 towers with a horizon line 3/4 up the way, and then we mirror inverse, not exactly, but generally mirror inverse the conic device, so that the profile in the soffit that you would experience at the base is now seen as a device which completely, when you see it from any point of view, corrugates or changes the profile of the project, and meanwhile the glazing works in a kind of defamiliarizing fashion. And very simple project in the channel. You can see the disproportionate size of the core to the footprint of the project, and the boutique nature of the hotel means that everything becomes very thin, very small, very circulation oriented. And here's the view from within the context of the project, looking back out to the city. There's actually a context of some size already on the site. Now, I talked today about silver projects in the class, and I made mention that the first use of aluminum in any great capacity was on the top of the Chrysler building in 1936. And so part of the rhetorical aspect of what a silver project is a number of reasons. It can only signal the new or not the old in terms of material that's, let's say, like masonry, has a long history. The other specific thing, just phenomenologically about the specific use of the material, of course, and it's rendered here, is what happens to the gradient between a surface which is facing almost directly into the sun, a hot spot, as we would say, and the fall off into various tonalities. It's as though this material, and this is why, not only me, this is why architects go this way sometimes in many respects. It's for people who want their buildings to read in relief all the time, and maybe that's an architect who believes in the tectonic as opposed to the mysterious. So here in this particular case, in these images, we want the project to read. We want it to read in a way clearly, but of course the Gestalt reading of it all is you're having a little bit of a problem kind of tracking how many shafts are going on, what happens when we crease these windows into smaller dimensions and then open them back up and so forth. So material and material effects and geometric effects are really part of this idea of making, I want to say, the lesser known project and still allowing you to understand it from a purely geometric point of view. You can see that the slab is fairly thin and we get long rooms and very deep rooms here, corner suites and so forth. But these kinds of different room typologies are part of the so-called boutique experience. Now, oddly enough, I say that just because I never thought we'd get a commission in my home state of Texas, but even more odd, it's in El Paso. I think there's a new movie coming out called Sirocco or something like that. It takes place in Juarez, and it's interesting, this city of El Paso. It's the beginning of the West. It literally means the pass in Spanish. It's also the entrance to the chaotic South, and the chaotic South of Mexico. So it's a little visited place. It's off the map, yet at the same time, it's completely on the map. This is the Interstate 10 that runs all the way across the country. You can keep driving and get to Los Angeles at the end. Here's the parched desert landscape. There's a brand new baseball stadium. It becomes a kind of spectacle device, and here's a view back to the city from Juarez at the border, and here's the border between U.S. and Mexico. Politically fraught. You've got all ideas about what may or may not happen with the issue of immigration and so forth. Juarez is one of the world's most violent and dangerous cities, and for 4 years in a row, El Paso has been voted one of the safest cities. And so there's a perverse dualism and dichotomy, but I want to say, you know, it's forgetting all of that and just thinking about what this particular site is. Our site is on the roof of a 3-story brick building owned by a telecommunications company. The telecommunications company is doing something that's indiscriminate to the border. They lay pipes and cable into Juarez, into Monterrey, into New Mexico. So on the one hand, physicality, borders, divisions, political strife, danger and security are all completely undermined in the idea of what we all want, which is total access. Total digital access all the time. So in a way, the conceptual problem to this project was how to make a project which was going to mark a site, be physical, articulate an urban corner. It's 200 meters away from the border and so forth. But at another level, we were just asking conceptual questions at the same time, which is the roof the top of a building or the beginning of a new building or the ground plane of a new building between the earth and the sky? Our commission was to design a 10,000 square foot office addition for Transtelco to house 40 people. It's got an art gallery and an exterior deck. This is a place that will become, in the city of El Paso, the first major architectural statement. There's no other compelling piece of work there. Now, I don't say that to boast. I just sort of say, well, that's a unique scenario to be given the opportunity to be underwritten in a way where this is supposed to be a project that will change the vision of the politicians and what can happen in this particular city. This is the corner that hangs over the city. It's an 18-foot cantilever. There's workspaces and private offices, usual type of open plan. This is a special office for the owner's cousins. They're cattle traders. Did you know that people still trade cattle? And so there's cattle trading going on in here. This is a lobby with an art gallery for local artists with a reception area. And it's a multi-generational family. This is a private office for the father of the two brothers who founded the company. And so you know that there's stories and I would say that their power within the city is significant and thus allowing things like 18-foot cantilevers to be accepted readily in the city. There's the elevation. Now, and the connection of the very, very simple project. It's very much a project that I want you to, in architectural terms, I'm gonna decode it for you. At the same time, I'm using explanation to try to persuade. It's a hot environment. We have views, and it's a very simple volume. On the north, there's no brise soleil. We don't have any direct sun. It's a high-performance triple glaze system that deals with the heat. On the east, there's a lot of direct sun. As you know, it's very low. We put a loggia out there. And we have a soffit that's 18 feet deep and painted 3 colors of metal panel. That just does one small radial conic transition between the horizontal and the vertical. You can take that piece and go back to the initial dumb diagram that I did and understand what we're trying to do is not at the level of economy. It's actually about the lesser known becoming a kind of cool, valuable device. On the south, It's got an overhang and a clerestory glass. We have a lot of direct sun here. We didn't want to put a screen, and the screen extends beyond on the east, and we've calculated very closely how the shadow will protect this area of glass before the sun comes around. So we're being good architects at the level of environmental control, but at the same time, to me, what this whole project is a project about, is it a pavilion? Is it a detached object? Is it an object that is connected to the building? So if you look at this part of the project, not only does it extend out and become a rebuilt landscape project, by the time it hops over the parapet and then cantilevers all the way out, it's actually a bizarre kind of mongrel hybrid project where we want ambiguous readings of what's going on. It's a very simple steel frame, very, very lightweight. We have no earthquake heaviness to deal with. So the frame is a 20-foot on-center steel structure, 6 inches, and they sit all on top of the concrete structure below. And this is the reflected ceiling plan, and 3 sort of colored sand traps in a field in a fairway of white, 2 skylights. This is a orange soffit over the main conference room, and then we've got a grayscale over the gallery where we don't want to have any light bouncing around, and you can see that. This is the stair coming from below and all the furniture. This is looking to the loggia on the east, so it obviously filters the light across the space. Different type of light coming from the south, and ambient light coming from the north. And the elevator lobby from the street is essentially an ambiguous world. It's both a lobby and a gallery space at the same time, and a big sectional shift. And the reason why this is shifted up is because all the ductwork and everything is loaded underneath the building to service it from below. The next project is it's one of my favorite projects, and it's for a museum in Tokyo for Sori Yanagi, who's like the Charles Eames of Japan. He passed away at the age of 95 about 4 years ago. And his family has a foundation, and they've asked my office to design a museum that will house essentially an ongoing exhibition of the legacy of his work. His work, as you see here, is owned by almost everyone in Japan. It's not really the same with the Eames. Only certain cool aficionados own an Eames chair or Eames sofa or something like that. But this stuff is super ubiquitous, and it's almost in everybody's household. He's well known, but he's also not well known at the same time. If you ask a lot of people who designed that, they might not know. Here's the elephant stool, which is still in production by Vitra, very beautiful piece, injection molded plastic tripod. This is the site for the project. It's in Shibuya. It's a proposed site. And currently it's a small, it poses as a park, but it's really scooter parking in a very quiet, I should say, part of Shibuya, a bit removed from all the chaos and the shopping of what we usually imagine Shibuya crossing to be. So this is a bit of the quiet world of Shibuya, and it's surrounded by the hardware, the machinery of Japanese architecture, which is strident, repetitive, exploitational of value of land and so forth. So on this site, we're actually building propose to build a very, very modest project. I don't have images. I kind of forgot to put them in, but as a story for the project. But if you would just imagine 3 images on the screen. One is a pot to boil water in that Yanagi designs, really beautiful. That's one. Second one is a plan of the Pantheon. The third one is a gray dot. Now, our project is about the gray dot. Even though a circular building has to take on architectural history, and in the case of doing a project for an industrial designer, you might imagine that by default or by definition, either through connotation or intention, it would have to take on product design. And it's just a reminder of saying that a gray dot, a plan of a circular building, and a pot all just use Platonic geometry, and that's constantly transposed into some specific medium or condition. In this case, we chose the circle to be able to essentially radiate itself out as an object in the landscape, and then, of course, as an architectural problem, the issue is how do you get into a circle? You can put a door in a perimeter of a circular building and be blunt about it and just penetrate it, in a very, very hardcore way. But in this particular case, when you look at this, you can see the entrance on the right up this small set of stairs into a plaza with a grid of 9 trees. The reading of the project is pretty curious. Okay, it sits on a concrete base, but it's not exactly sitting on a base here. We have a levitating floor slab. The base finally emerges into a kind of displaced socle that itself is cut into with a set of stairs. So it's a bit of a displaced figure. It finds itself connected to the landscape through this device. So it's a pure circle for the most part, and it's interrupted twice. Here's the service elevator, which connects obviously from 2 floors and also allows for loading. And we designed that service elevator to look like an entrance, although it's not. And the entrance, of course, is this shrink-wrapped moment of a small transition between the chaos of the city, a dimension which is really very, very tight and ergonomic, like a piece of furniture, that finds itself through all of our simple cylindrical and conic transitions connecting the project, but in this case we're using welded steel construction, just like Ito and Sana and so many others there because of their familiarity with it. So these are all welded joints between the pieces, and by the time we specify the paint to do exactly what we want, only in certain lighting conditions, and you can see it in these renders, can you pick up a crease or a joint that describes these as flat surfaces. There's a conic transition in plan right here that moves up to this. So rhetorically, what we're trying to say here on the one hand is we're less about the Pantheon and more about the gray dot, but we also have some reference to industrial design, because it wouldn't escape you very easily to say that this moment right here is like a nozzle or a handle. Now, let's say it's the lesser known version of the handle, but it is nonetheless operating at some level like that. It's a shrink-wrapped condition, and again, like the no mass house, it's what you see is what you get project. There's no poche in the project. So even when you enter, you can already see the destination and the way in which the crumpling of the disc or the cylinder is presented. Now, Yanagi's work is very simple. There's no weird stuff going on. Why would we be the appropriate architects for this project? I mean, there are reasons why we got the project, not altogether strictly based on our work, although I've been an admirer and fan of Yanagi's for many, many years. This isn't a case of deferring to Sori Yanagi, nor is it a case of pushing NMDA into the mix. It's really let's say, a détente between two very, very strong sensibilities. And in this case, the way in which a surface which is clearly working not at the level of responding to an exhibition space, but the effects, the sort of after effects on the one hand of dealing with the notion of entrance itself, produces a dramatic effect. Now, even just when you turn away from that and you find yourself in a different position within the space, here's the elevator, which is the kind of bizarre non-entrance to the space. It starts to calm down and become very, very simple, and even when you go downstairs into a gallery space, there's a video hall. It's very, very quiet and very simple, and you can come out and find this description of the project, nearly a shrink wrapping of the ergonomics. This is the bulkhead for the exit stair from below. So this Sokol goes from a plaza to something that looks like a base to then a bulkhead back to the base, which itself reveals in the clerestory window the office is down below, and then as you saw on the other side, it simply becomes a cantilevered levitating base on the inside. So I show you these two projects back to back because they're isolated platonic figures with manipulations done to them for specific effects relative to the program or site. This is a project in Beverly Hills. We've been working on it for 4 years. This is the third and final iteration of the project. The site is right here. This is Wilshire Boulevard. It's got 40 years of flora and fauna of architectural office building of every type. Corduroy concrete and reflective glass. 90s postmorphosis, layering, straightforward 50s modernism, and so forth. And so even in this project for an office building with no other agenda of a machine make 32,000 feet, it needs to be as of right connected to the conditions of the city. Very, very challenging city to build in. Unlike Los Angeles, there's an aesthetic review board that you have to sit in front of, and they get to judge you and your project and so forth. So I won't spend too much time on this other than to say we went through a number of iterations that were probably much, much more elaborate than this. And we had to come back to a project that when you look at it, the only thing that we're doing is working on the spandrel panels and the parapet because this is a glass building. I won't say in disguise, but I will just simply say it's a glass building. Now, what your eye is drawn to, of course, is not the glass, but all the things that we're doing with the surface geometry, with the color, with the fall off of the material and so forth. So while we're not using these types of geometric shapes, we are certainly working with the idea of where we use the cone on the corner connected to a triangulated, beveled surface that's mirrored up above each time. So in some ways, this whole meditation on how this geometry produces or induces an idea that curvature and radiality are sending you messages about the new, or let's say the lesser known, in relation to color, because there's not another purple building in Beverly Hills or in Los Angeles. And so somebody asked me today about this issue, and I said quite often it's a reactionary project. Whether it's you do that, we do this, a kind of latent reactionary move. In this case, while there isn't another building of this color, it also is, of course, the color of royalty, right? What is Wimbledon is green and purple, and so we know all those sorts of things. So we are telling a story about the curious case of Beverly Hills wanting and now to have architecture replace all of the iconography that Beverly Hills is known for, like Paris Hilton and Kim Kardashian and so forth, that they really would like architecture to become a serious enterprise. And yet, here I want to say that we couldn't pass this project unless we made an argument about its logic of color being useful only to a place like Beverly Hills for whose status doesn't want to be completely undermined or ridiculed at all. I think this is the last project. This is a chapel for Gwangju, Korea. It was designed as an extension for this women's university, Gwangju Women's University. It's a Christian chapel up in a very verdant, small mountainside that you can drive to and park and also walk. It's really for the entire city. Everybody in the city is within 20 minutes of this little tiny chapel. This is the roof. And it's made out of Corten steel, as you can see. And I just wanted to explain let's say the ambition of this project. We'd never worked on a religious project before, and it wasn't necessarily daunting or intimidating. I felt more intimidated designing furniture and something that was really out of my comfort level on the one hand. And the only thing I could think of was, well, it's a Christian church, and Christian faith and belief has been in Korea for 600 years. Jesuit priests traveled to China and delivered books on Western theology that then were brought back by, in this case, Korean priests and theologians back to Korea. So Christianity's been in Korea a long, long time, and it's become, I think, since the last 40 or 50 years, and especially maybe the last 20 years, young and very affluent Koreans are becoming Christian. It's still only 20% of the population, so it's not the dominant religious affiliation. Now, given that, it made I was raised as a Catholic and could draw on certain kinds of memories of what ritual was about. But what comfort level we had was, of course, as opposed to saying, well, I've studied Buddhism and I've shaved my head or gave it a pretty close shave once in Japan and spent 3 weeks doing Zazen training and so forth, and that if somebody said design a Buddhist temple, would I have the experience to do it? I think, for architects, if we had to claim we had the experience to do what we wanted to do, we'd never do that much because, quite frankly, we rely on research and so forth. But here, making a project in which, two American artists, Judd and Sarah, both working in the same material, different means, different ways in which geometry is going to both describe enclosure in a very straightforward way here in the Torque d'Ellipse in UCLA in a very much more ambiguous way. And this is a drawing by Walter Pichler, who's a passed away artist, architect, very Catholic, who made this drawing in the 1970s, where you can see, of course, the body, the form of sacrifice, all in blood, drawn with the cross. So how do you put the history of the procession of a church and its organizational logic and history and the centrally planned figure into one? And so we've just simply tried to design a project that is ambiguous at every level, that there is a loose axis to the site. It's not articulated by the door, but it's articulated by the seating. Of course, the perimeter is not. It's longer in this direction than it is wide, yet it doesn't operate at all in terms of service because there's no services that are held. It's simply a place to meditate. So the specific geometry that we're trying to articulate is a diagonal arc in the form of two cones which loosely describe a linear axis, let's say the nave of the piece, that is readable, on the inside, but at the same time, by the time you enter and experience the project, geometrically its complexity begins to be vaguely orienting. The apex of that is centered over the top of the crucifix, but of course the light only comes from one side, and the issue of symmetry and asymmetry of linear axis and centrality and stasis. The floor is stepping, so it's also got its own kind of sectional qualities, and it's a project that I think that it says a lot about, let's say, for us as an office, and hopefully these projects, the degree of capability and diversity we have with exploring this idea of the lesser known, meaning the thing that you think you know. We don't design bowler hats and put them out into odd situations and you go, I know that and I've seen it and here it is in a weird situation. We cut up the bowler hat and put it back together again so that you know somewhere there's an origin that you do know, but it's in a lesser known state, I would say. And I have a 3-minute video to end, and if you don't mind, and it's a video that I made for the 50th anniversary of the Aarhus School of Architecture. Is their 50th anniversary, and they invited, I think, 15 architects to submit a video, and so I wanted to do a kind of a love letter about Los Angeles in this video. The soundtrack gets a little loud at the end, but just for about 10 or 15 seconds. So. That's it, thank you. So I will take questions if anybody wants to hang around. How difficult is it to build some of them?
To locate contractors.
What's that?
To locate contractors.
Oh, to locate contractors. It's a good question, and sometimes challenging. Not so much. I think your question about who's going to build it is more important than what it is, because we make sure that in the hands of somebody who knows what they're doing, it's quite achievable. In the case of our project in El Paso, for instance, the whole skin is being built in Korea, and an installer, a company from Houston, is coming over from Houston, pretty far afield. They're the closest ones to be able to have the know-how to take this stuff. And as a for instance, so I'll fly to Korea with the installer to the factory to look at all the parts and pieces before they come, so that they're familiar and we're all familiar about what needs to happen. And even some of the pieces will be put together in the factory, as a dry fit, and then we take it back, because obviously we want to cut down on the mystery and the problems. I didn't show our building in New York, but that's where we learned everything. 6 continents were involved in all the production and pieces. I went to every factory, looked at everything. My team did as well. So if you want to build something, let's say in a fairly remote place like that, and you want a craft that's supposed to be at the level of making the bold statement that the building is supposed to change the face of architecture, well, even if you're not discriminating, you wouldn't want anybody to look at it and say, well, if that's what architecture is, I don't want it, right? So we do have to work hard, but there's a network of people and facade consultants and so forth that we are fortunate to be a part of with almost all of these projects. And a lot of stuff comes from offshore to get a higher level of product for, let's say, a very competitive rate. And the world has changed. Everything used to come from Germany if it was good glass, and Asia in 10 years has changed all of that. So it's great. And we managed to do things really well.
So how did the cattle get the cattle trade?
What's that?
How did the cattle get at the cattle trade?
Jeff, they don't have the auctions up there.
I didn't think it looked like they weren't very many cattle, but I still couldn't figure out how to get that.
No.
I can tell you a lot of questions. A lot of questions about how buildings are moving around, particularly in Los Angeles. Lots of real admiration and some doubts. But the building in El Paso for me is a particularly special surprise. For it to meet that roof with such callous disregard, to appear that it was like a spaceship looking for a parking place that just did a bad job. To land flat on it and to miss and all that. I mean, it is really special. I mean, and I think it does some incredible architectural work in a way we were talking about lunch about how something could look like it was out without conceit. So it's particularly a surprise, because you're very attentive to how your buildings leave the ground. And the opposite side of that, and I mean this actually critically, is the Los Angeles building, for all of the weight and the promise of the windows and the silver, to float it, to float it without even the acknowledgement of the weight, even of the dematerialized circle in the museum, in the Japanese museum, with a little, you're trying to dematerialize that lobby entirely, so that weight, we should go to some effort to give it real mass by the depth of the reflection and all the optics of it. That just seemed incongruous to me and inexplicable in the city. It kind of cries out for some, you have good cantilever, so the way it would be like building a
Mm-hmm.
So I was really curious about that, and my first reaction was really negative.
Mm-hmm. I see
I
that.
know you think about these things quite a bit, but each project has all of those thoughts quite palpable. So those are two critical topics. And I'm really curious about, I don't mean this, you know, we never see when you do a competition, we don't see
The process stuff.
well, I don't see the after, when you go in, you compare yourself to the winner, and you try to see what went well and what went bad. But for example, why did the house get canceled? Was it money? Was it?
The aftermath of all of those? Yeah.
When we did the post, what do you call that? The post-mortem, or when
Mhm.
you get back from another planet, they
Mhm.
drag it over and they make an expression, whatever they call it. The debriefing.
Yeah.
So, and a lot of times I'm interested in it. Like, why did that go wrong? What happened? Why do you think that? The Porsche competition was a quite interesting competition. You saw the winners. What do you think happened?
Yeah, in the case of the house, I mean they divorced.
Usually, what happens with a great piece of art.
I'm not sure entirely if it was over the project.
You don't need a house. You need a divorce.
Yeah. They were curiously in unison quite a bit over it. I think that they had their problems otherwise. In the case of the Porsche Tower, I might go on record by saying that we were the only office outside of Central Europe and the UK to be invited, and there was curiosity on the form of the organizer for our work, but I would say in the end, from what I heard, we were never going to win, never, with that project. And I just want to say also that in the case of that and so many other projects, in the first page of the brief, you read the brief very closely, and in bold letters it said, "We would like a building of an outstanding appearance," right? Just straight away talking about you're supposed to deliver a new form, for our city. And you read that, and based on your interests and so forth, you say, well, great, that's why we're involved in this. Because I would argue that there's no strong high-rise culture in Europe. They're mostly architects who don't specialize in it. You could say Foster does, and Prix has done a number, but there's not as much of a high-rise culture, certainly not for building them, because it's just not what goes on, not like in Asia. So we actually thought it was a curious, not a setup of any kind, but that it would be reasonable for us to go all out, which is what we did, and what we heard was it was too outrageous, for the developer. And we made our. By the way, it was a competition for which you didn't go present. You hand it in, and then it's a jury, and they have their thoughts and comments and so forth. Which, in today's world, I think is. I want to be in front of the. I want to hypnotize. As much as I can. And that's how we get most of the projects we're getting now, in the same way, being able to find some moment where bodies in space really are different than pictures on a wall where somebody's judging and trying to read the aura of what's there. They said it was controversial, and like a lot of competitions, were we going to get fourth place or not? And we didn't. Not regretful that we, did the project, but at the end of the day, knowing who won and all the first invited architects like Boeri and us and 3XN didn't get anything. And the architects who had to put in credentials to get into the competition, they were the ones who won. So whatever the organizers were saying to the client, which is you need something new, and let's make good on this idea that it should have a unique appearance, didn't happen. It just simply didn't happen. And everything else is a live project. So we haven't lost anything other than what I showed there.
I mean, for 18 months of work, you're obviously going quickly, you're doing the work much faster for you to maintain a level of generosity and integrity and willingness to meet new criteria. It's amazing.
Yeah, I think making up for lost time, I guess. Any other questions? Anybody else? Anybody from the class have a question? No? Okay. Well, I want to thank you, Justin, and for very much for hosting me, and Jeff and Rob and everybody at the school. I love coming back here, and thanks very much.